Hello, welcome and good evening. Today I want to upgrade the 386 Retro PC, and so far I've got a Gotek Floppy emulator in there, and I think I have one somewhere around here. This is the box. Of course I've got a black one because I've got a black case. This is another one that I plan to repurpose for some other machine. Yeah, the Gotek Floppy emulator is very handy because it lets you use all kinds of DOS disk images on a USB drive, which you put in here. It has a standard 34-pin floppy connector, and you can just plug it in as a drop-in replacement for a floppy drive without the hassle of the unreliability of floppy disks. Many of the floppy disks will have ceased to function after 30 years or so, and yeah, so this is very handy in day-to-day usage of the Retro PC. However, floppy drives do still have some nice features, mainly nostalgia for me, because having a physical medium is, well, much nicer than just having a thumb drive or a compact flash card or being able to download from anywhere on the internet. But basically it's more involved. You have to handle the physical medium, you have to pull levers and put something in, and it takes a while. You much more appreciate what you're doing there. It's the same, for example, with vinyl records. I think they are very popular again because of the whole ceremony of playing a record. You don't just skip through it, you celebrate listening to the music, looking at the nice big artwork, handling the media, hearing the crackle and everything. So that's a nice thing. And the same goes for the floppy drives. And the Gotek is a replica of a 3.5-inch floppy drive, so something which you can see below here as a 5.25-inch floppy drive. And the medium for this will be something like this. This is a true floppy disk because it's floppy. It doesn't have a hard shell. The older people around here will still know what this is. They have been around for 40 years at least, I would guess. Probably even a bit longer. Before that we had 8-inch floppy disks, which were just a little bit taller and wider, but basically the same principle. So you have a plastic disc coated with some magnetic material, ferrous oxide or I don't know what, and it's in a protective sleeve, plastic sleeve. In the sleeve there's a little bit of cloth that helps reduce friction and reduce scratches on the disc. And other than that, there's just this index hole, and we can turn the disc, and at some point we will see a matching hole in the disc, which tells the disk drive with a little light and a photo sensor where track 0 starts. Okay, so this drive in particular is, I think, a drive that was probably used in a IBM PC-80, so in 286 probably. And I say probably because it is a YD380 1.2 megabytes, so a high density disk drive, manufactured for IBM Corporation. And this is the hint here that it must be from an IBM 80. I won't be using this exact drive because I've already put it in the machine, and while it runs it has some problems. Namely, it will read and write some disks, and I think it's destroying disks. So there's a whole bunch of mechanism here. So when you pull the lever down, this plastic thing here will lower down and clamp, or it's basically a clutch. It will clamp down the floppy disk, to the flywheel and motor of the main disk drive. I think we have two motors here. This is probably one of them here. This is definitely one. This is a stepper motor, I think, for the read and write heads, which are under here. The read and write heads will go up and down along this rail, or these two rails. That's also what makes most of the sounds of a floppy drive. And anyway, somehow these read and write heads are making marks on the floppy disk. So I can show you here. If I put this up here, you will see two scratches basically. And that's, I think, not good, not optimal. And down here as well. I think this is from the floppy drive. So I got another one, also black unit matching the case, but nowhere near as elegant as this one. And this is a real old one. Manufacturing date was 1986, week 40. So this drive is more than 30 years old. Well, I will definitely come back to this drive because I bet you can fix it. It's still running. Everything is spinning. It reacts to all the signals, and so there's no problem there. I think it's purely a mechanical problem with the read-write heads. Maybe we have to clean it, maybe have to adjust something a little bit. So it should definitely be doable, but this will be for another day. And I think with IBM equipment, it might even be that we can find a service manual or something similar. If any of you have experience with floppy drives, I don't. So this is basically everything new to me, but I'm happy to take your hints and advice. And my hope is that since this is a brand model and pretty well common drive, I hope, that there's the possibility of repairing it. It's anyway a very nice drive, and yeah. So let's put in the other drive, and I'll show you how to connect it up. Okay, so this is the second drive. This is the old IBM drive. This here is Mitsumi branded, which is still a brand name. Later they did more cheap drives, and this is already much later in the PC's lifespan, I would say, because it's already much smaller. As you can see, there's like, well, let's say 1 centimeter missing here at the back, so it's more compact. The exterior dimensions otherwise are of course more or less the same. The PCB is more compact. You have I guess the motor control here. I guess the drive motor is under here. Then the stepper motor looks much cheaper than this huge chunk over there. So this is a much simpler design. But other than that, this looks fine. What do you need to connect this up to your PC? A floppy cable. And the floppy cables come with different connectors. There are different kinds. Many of the more modern ones that you will find will only have these 34-pin connectors, but no edge connector. And for the 5¼ inch, you need the edge connector because there's an edge connector here. And if you take a close look here, the first two pins, after the first two pins, there's a gap. And this complies with the notch over here, so you can't put it on the wrong way. As well as for the 3½ inch connectors, there will be a notch here which fits to the socket usually, but with the Gotek you have to be careful because you can actually put it the wrong way up here, so it has to go down like this. Okay. Also take care of the polarity for the power supply. Usually when you do this, you will notice that both with the 3½ inch, the red will point towards the power supply, and so will the connector when you put it on the 5¼ inch. Red points always to the side of the power supply. And on the power supply it's the same. It uses this big Molex connector the red wire will always be towards the middle of the drive, and the ground cables will be to the outwards. So red and red will go together on floppy drives. So we'll put that in now. We will use one screw in my modern case to attach it more firmly, because the plastic cheapo ATX holders are not that great. So make sure that you connect the floppy cable with the right pin to the right side. Pin number 1 is usually marked. As you can see here, it's the outward bound pin, and the red stripe marks pin 1 on the cable. So making sure that it's all nice and well seated, we can turn on the machine. And with almost any halfway new vintage machine, like my 386 from 1990, the floppy disk drive is actually auto-detected, and we're going to insert a floppy here. And this is running as drive B, because drive A is the Gotek. So let's have a look with the dir command. And as you can see, it will load up just fine. So this is Zach McCracken here. Let's switch to the drive and run Zach. And of course, it's not as fast as running the same thing from the compact flash or even an old vintage hard disk, but it's nice that you have the floppy disk sounds when accessing the game. And actually the load times, especially for those old games from the 80s or maybe 90, 91, around that time frame, is not that bad. So it definitely adds to the nostalgia and to the feel and look of an old vintage machine. So let's have a quick listen here and then check out what else we can do with the drive. And of course, whenever you get new floppy disks or you want to erase the old ones, you need to format the floppy disks. Here I'm using PC format from the PC Tools set of programs, and this takes roughly 2 to 3 minutes per disk if you do a full format, and we can accelerate this here so you don't have to wait for that. But anyway, formatting a disk like that can actually revive it a bit if it goes bad, but it might also be that the media, of course, has degraded over the last 2 or 3 decades, because actually it's a very long time. And here we copy another game, Manic Mansion, to the floppy disk to test it out using the DOS controller. And this also takes roughly 2 minutes or so, and we'll accelerate that. So using the floppy drive was actually a pleasure. I had some hiccups here and there, but the old diskettes that I got were new old stock basically. They were still shrink wrapped, and the only thing I had to do was to format them. That's a nice thing actually. And as you can see, the executables take quite a bit of time to copy over, and yeah, the speed of a floppy drive is roughly maybe 20 kilobytes per second or so. So that's really kilobytes and not megabytes or anything. So it really takes some time. And yeah, here we load up Maniac Mansion, and it's similar to Zach McCracken. It was released in 1987, so it's definitely a game that many people used to run from a floppy drive. Back when this came out, the very expensive PCs had like 10 megabyte hard drives or something like that, but I guess the majority of people would have played this from floppy, so load times are more or less optimized. You see quite a couple of seconds black screen here while the disk is being accessed, and then the intro starts with the usual intro music and stuff. And you have to remember, machines back then also had maybe 256 to 512k of RAM, so you couldn't just load all the game data into RAM and play it without having ever to access the disk again. That just wouldn't work, because you wouldn't have nearly enough RAM for that. And hard disks changed that quite a bit. One of my most favorite programs of all time is VGA Copy. This is a shareware program for copying and formatting floppy disks. And this is totally over the top, made by a German coder named Thomas Mönkemeyer. I think he was very talented, but look at this intro screen. If this doesn't scream 1990s, I don't know what does, and the font is directly taken from Deluxe Paint, I think. Yeah, this is the very nice DOS graphical user interface for that. And now we're filling the memory buffer with 1.2 megabytes for formatting a high-density 5.25-inch floppy disk. The nice thing about VGA Copy was that you could also format the 5.25-inch floppies with 1.4 megabytes, maybe losing a bit of compatibility or reliability, but gaining 240 extra kilobytes. And again, we're fast forwarding here, so you don't have to watch the whole formatting process. And 1.4 megabyte 3.5 inch discs could also be formatted as 1.7 megabytes. So yeah, let's put another game on there, this time Populous. And if you're wondering why I'm doing that, I do have these games on original media as well, but honestly, with the age, I don't trust the drives not to thrash those disks. So this is also what I would suggest to most of you enthusiasts. Just take, for example, most of the games are also available on GOG.com. That's also where I bought Maniac Mansion and Zack McCracken. And there are some less legal sites, which I won't name, where you can also get the software and then put them onto floppy disks and play those, instead of ruining perhaps old valuable disks. I would simply use the old disks if I wanted to do an archive and salvage data that is not available anywhere else. So yeah, that's definitely something to consider, and there are special solutions for that, something like CryoFlux and other programs and hardware adapters especially, to read out ailing and failing old disks. So yeah, that's definitely a problem with those old disks, and also with the drives. If you've seen, one of my drives doesn't work quite well, the other does. So it's a bit of a lucky draw if you're having luck or not. Plus, of course, the games that you can play from the floppy drive are limited, usually to the era of the 1980s. Some of the early 1990 games are still playable from disk. Something like Monkey Island 1 can be played from floppy disk, but it depends also on the version. I think the AEGA version definitely is playable. VGA, I don't know, maybe it requires a hard disk, but Monkey Island 2, for example, definitely requires a hard disk. So you're definitely limited to the very old games. And for today, that more or less wraps it up. I would like to thank you and hope that you learned something. Please do hit the subscribe and the like button. And if you want to support me, I'm over on Ko-Fi and also on Patreon. So if you want to help me out, feel free to do that. It will be greatly appreciated, and I can finance this hobby a bit more and get some nice, cool new stuff to show you. Thanks again, and see you soon.